In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the mysterious Dark Watchers of California and the ghost of an actress that led to her death from the Hollywood sign in 1932. For 300 years, the Dark Watchers have been seen in the Santa Lucia Mountains. Those who have seen them say that before they spotted the Watchers, they felt like someone or something was watching them. Who or what the Dark Watchers are, no one knows. We don't know where they came from or why they are specifically seen in the Santa Lucia Mountains. What they're looking for is anyone's guess. The Spanish settlers gave them their name, which translates in English to the Dark Watchers. According to the accounts of Spanish settlers from the 1700s, the Watchers are 10 feet tall and they appear to be draped in cloaks and they have very large wide-brimmed hats. Once they're spotted, they usually disappear quickly, or they sometimes will turn to follow the person that's looking at them. Other descriptions say they are typically very tall humanoid entities that are between 7 to 15 feet and they are dressed in all black. Sometimes they have sticks in their hands. Their arms are usually spread apart with a halo or a corona of sunlight radiating from behind them. Their form makes them look human, but it's just like the Creeper in Jeepers Creepers. They dress as men, only to disguise that they're not. They're almost always silent and are usually seen at a distance up on ridges around dusk or dawn. It's like they're looking over their domain. There's one story of a local man who went hiking in the mountains sometime in the 60s. He saw the Dark Watchers and somehow he had enough time to study and process exactly what he was seeing. He called out to some fellow hikers in order to alert them to the Dark Watchers' presence, but when he turned back to where the figures had been standing, they had vanished. Thomas Steinbeck, the son of author John Steinbeck, collaborated with artist Benjamin Brode on a book that was titled In Search of the Dark Watchers, and in that book they chronicle the legend's history and they record interviews with local people who have claimed to have seen the Watchers. John Steinbeck wrote of them in his short story, Flight. The short story tells of a teenage boy who has killed a man and he's forced to run into the Santa Lucia Mountains to hide. But when he leaves, his mother tells him to avoid the Dark Watchers. She says, "When thou comest to the high mountains, if thou seest any of the dark watching men, go not near them, nor try to speak to them." Thomas Steinbeck said his grandmother was a school teacher, and she didn't play around, but she believed firmly in the Watchers. She told her children and her grandchildren that she would leave fruit or nuts in the canyon on her way to school in Big Sur, and on her way back, there would be flowers in their place. So supposedly she was exchanging these gifts with the Dark Watchers. Here are a few stories of people that have allegedly seen the Dark Watchers. I was driving home from a beach trip with my girlfriend in 2016 when we saw a large shadow figure glide across the road in front of our headlights. There were no noticeable features, just a large, dark, shadowy creature. If my girlfriend wasn't awake to confirm what I just saw, I would have chalked it up to me being tired, but she also saw it. We let it go until a few days later when we brought it up again and we searched up shadow people and learned about Dark Watchers in Santa Lucia. This is so crazy to learn that we are not alone in this experience. Another story says, all you see is just a tall, dark silhouette. They almost look like horses, standing on their hind legs with the assistance of a walking stick. It's pretty creepy, and nobody has ever seen them up close. They disappear the moment that you try to get closer. While flying my twin engine on a southerly course and just 20 nautical miles north of Vandenberg Air Force Base, I glanced toward the Santa Lucia Range just after sunset and saw what appeared to be 7 large, dark figures that were spaced evenly apart. They had an even spacing of about 1/4 of a mile. I mentioned these Spanish settlers, but also American settlers saw them as well. They also reported the feeling of being watched from above. And folklore warns that it's wisest to turn away because those who have dared to approach these figures have disappeared without a trace. Now let's talk about what these dark shadows could be, according to science. Even though science has suggested that Watchers might simply be due to a hallucination, that doesn't mean that people aren't still spooked by it. One theory is that the Dark Watchers are an example of pareidolia, and that's when our brains seek out recognizable patterns or shapes when there aren't any. And this image is one of my favorite examples of pareidolia. It's just a sink with soap and water going down a drain, but it looks just like an eye. There's also a phenomenon that's called the Brocken specter, and it's when shadows are cast on misty mountain peaks. And if the sun is behind the person, the mist plays with the shadow, making it look huge and threatening. The Watchers are also seen at high altitudes where oxygen supply to the brain is hampered. Another theory says that infrared, low-frequency sounds have been suggested to cause feelings of fear in people who hear them. Now this is a glory. It's a sequence of colored rings that resemble a rainbow, framing the shadow of the observer on a cloud that's made up of many small water droplets, and on very rare occasions. A glory can occur on dew instead of a cloud. So what do you think the Dark Watchers are? Do you believe what the scientists say, or do you think that they are more sinister? Since we're talking about California, have you ever heard that the Hollywood sign is haunted? I'll tell you about it in just a minute, but first I wanted to tell you briefly about another case that's related to the Hollywood sign. In 2012, a man's head, 2 feet, and 2 hands were found under the Hollywood sign. Some of his flesh was found later, but his torso has never been found. The remains belong to 66-year-old Harvey Medellin, and the crime was referred to as the Hollywood Head murder. It's believed that his ex-boyfriend Gabriel strangled him when he tried to break up with him. When Gabriel's internet history was searched, they saw that he had looked up sausage-making tools and meat saws a few days before the murder. After the crime, he read an article on how to dismember a body and drain the blood. He was arrested and was sentenced to 25 years to life. Now, back to the sign. The sign used to read Hollywoodland, and it was originally meant to be an advertisement for a new upscale housing community that was built in 1923. Each letter on the sign is 30 feet wide by 43 feet tall, and it had lights that would flash in succession. It would first blink Holly, then wood, and then land. And the sign was only meant to be there for a year and a half. Now let's talk about the ghost that is said to haunt the Hollywood sign. Her name is Peg Entwistle, and following the deaths of her father and her stepmother, she moved to Hollywood with her aunt and her uncle, and they were both in the theater business. The Hollywood sign was erected the same year that she moved to LA. And in the 1920s, Peg Entwistle wanted to be a star, just like Marlene Dietrich, and she began her acting career on the stage when she was 17. She would go on to appear in several Broadway productions, and in 1927, she was called the stage's It Girl. In 1927, she married a fellow actor. His name was Robert Keith, but the marriage didn't last because he was abusive. Now, on September 16th in 1932, after she failed to secure a contract, plus some other professional disappointments, Peg told her uncle that she was going to the drugstore. Instead, she went to the Hollywood sign. She climbed up to the 45-foot ladder behind the H, and the rest is history. She was 24 years old. A hiker found her body along with her shoe, her jacket, and her purse, which contained a note. She believed that she was a coward and she should have done this a long time ago because it would have saved her a lot of pain. Now, the police made a sweep of the area, and they soon found her body underneath the H. Shortly after she died, her uncle received a letter from a studio offering her another role. And joggers and rangers in LA's Griffith Park have reported seeing the ghost of the Hollywood sign. They describe her as a mysterious blonde woman, typically accompanied by a strong smell of gardenias, and the sightings began in the 1940s, and they are still reported today.